Of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining the same chilling tone and articulate style while slightly altering the word order and structure. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. In just 3 months during the autumn of 1823, the small Pennsylvania town of Millbrook recorded 17 unexplained deaths. What made these deaths particularly disturbing wasn't their number, but the fact that every single victim had been prepared for burial by the same family-owned funeral home. For over 2 decades, the Hartwell funeral parlor had served the community, earning a reputation for their compassionate treatment of grieving families and their meticulous care of the deceased. But during a routine health inspection, a traveling physician noticed peculiar marks on several bodies, uncovering evidence that would shake the foundations of this quiet Pennsylvania town. So horrifying was what authorities discovered in the basement of the Hartwell establishment that local officials buried the records for nearly a century. And the full truth, some say, has never been told. Before we continue with the story of the Hartwell family and their house of horrors, if dark historical mysteries like this one fascinate you, make sure to hit that notification bell and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most chilling true stories from America's past. Also, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our worldwide community of mystery lovers. But let me take you back to the Pennsylvania countryside of 1823, where the Hartwell family had built what appeared to be a respectable business on a foundation of unimaginable darkness. Nestled in the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania sat Millbrook, a community of barely 300 souls who made their living from farming, logging, and the occasional travelers who stopped at the town's single inn. The year 1823 marked a period of growth for the young American Republic. But small towns like Millbrook remained largely isolated from the bustling cities of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Here, neighbors knew each other's business, children played freely in the streets, and the currency that held the community together was trust. The Hartwell family had arrived in Millbrook in 1801 when Patriarch Ezekiel Hartwell purchased a large stone house on the outskirts of town and established the area's first dedicated funeral parlor. Before the Hartwells, families had prepared their own dead or relied on the local carpenter to build coffins. Initially viewed with suspicion by some townspeople, Ezekiel's professional approach to death care quickly won over the community with his respectful manner and fair prices. Living in the funeral home with Ezekiel were his wife Martha, their 3 children, sons Josiah and Caleb, and daughter Rebecca, along with Martha's elderly father, Thomas Creed. The family appeared to embody the Protestant work ethic that defined rural Pennsylvania. They attended Sunday services at the Methodist Church, participated in community barn raisings, and Martha was known for bringing pies to families experiencing hardship. The elder son, Josiah, at 26, had learned the embalming trade from his father and was expected to inherit the business. Assisting with carpentry and grave digging was Caleb, 23. Rebecca, just 19, helped her mother with domestic duties and often comforted grieving families with her gentle manner. Occupying a 3-story stone building with a wooden addition that housed the preparation rooms was the Hartwell establishment. Both the family's living quarters and the viewing area for the deceased were located on the main floor. The family's bedrooms were located on the 2nd floor, accessible by a narrow staircase, while another set of stairs descended to a basement converted into the embalming and storage area. Also on the property was a large barn where coffins were constructed and a small cemetery plot for those who couldn't afford burial elsewhere. Particularly trusted in the community were the Hartwells because of their willingness to serve families regardless of their ability to pay. Often during harsh winters when crops failed, they provided services in exchange for food or future labor. A network of grateful families throughout the region was created by this generosity, and word of their compassionate service spread to neighboring towns. By 1823, the Hartwell funeral parlor was handling nearly every death within a 15-mile radius. Tensions between traditional rural values and the encroaching influence of industrial progress marked the political climate of 1823 Pennsylvania. Nearing completion in New York was the Erie Canal, promising to bring unprecedented economic opportunity to the region, but also threatening to disrupt the established order of small-town life. Sweeping through Pennsylvania communities were religious revival movements, bringing both spiritual renewal and social upheaval as traditional authority structures were questioned. In this atmosphere of change and uncertainty, institutions like the Hartwell funeral parlor represented stability and continuity. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, something sinister was taking root in the Hartwell household. The isolation of their work, the trust placed in them by grieving families, and the very nature of their profession created opportunities that most people could never imagine. Not just their livelihood, but their obsession had become death. And the line between caring for the dead and creating them was about to be crossed in ways that would horrify anyone who discovered the truth. The first sign that something was amiss came on October 15, 1823, when Dr. Samuel Harrison arrived in Millbrook to conduct his annual health inspection of the surrounding townships. A traveling physician employed by the state to monitor disease outbreaks and ensure proper sanitary practices were being followed in rural communities was Dr. Harrison. His visits were routine affairs, typically involving examinations of water sources, food storage facilities, and burial practices. What initially drew Dr. Harrison's attention wasn't the number of recent deaths in Millbrook, but rather the unusual circumstances he observed during his mandatory inspection of the Hartwell funeral parlor. Required by Pennsylvania law was that all bodies be available for medical examination if requested by a state physician, a regulation implemented following several cholera outbreaks in the previous decade. Greeted warmly by Ezekiel Hartwell and his son Josiah was Dr. Harrison when he arrived at the Hartwell establishment on that crisp autumn morning. A tour of their facilities was given to him by the two men, who proudly displayed their modern embalming equipment and meticulously clean preparation rooms. Everything appeared to be in order until Dr. Harrison requested to examine 3 bodies that were currently in their care, preparing for burial services later that week. The first body belonged to Eleanora Fairchild, a 68-year-old widow who had allegedly died of consumption 3 days earlier. As Dr. Harrison conducted his examination, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Along Eleanora's neck, barely visible beneath the high collar of her burial dress, were faint but unmistakable bruise marks. Consistent with manual strangulation was the pattern, not the wasting disease that had supposedly claimed her life. When the marks were questioned by Dr. Harrison, Josiah Hartwell quickly explained that they had positioned Eleanor awkwardly during the embalming process, causing postmortem bruising. Plausible enough seemed the explanation, but something in Josiah's manner, a slight tremor in his voice, the way his eyes avoided direct contact, made Dr. Harrison decide to examine the other 2 bodies more carefully. That of Marcus Webb was the second body, a healthy 42-year-old farmer who had allegedly suffered a heart attack while working in his fields. Something even more disturbing was revealed by Dr. Harrison's examination: small puncture wounds on Webb's arms and chest, precisely placed and too deliberate to be accidental. When an explanation was pressed for, Ezekiel Hartwell claimed that Webb had fallen onto some farming tools during his collapse, but the wounds were too clean and purposeful for such a random accident. The most damning evidence was provided by the third body. Mary Patterson, a 26-year-old mother of 2, had supposedly died of a fever after a brief illness. However, discovered by Dr. Harrison were traces of a white powder residue around her mouth and fingernails. His medical training immediately recognized the substance as arsenic, a poison unfortunately common in rural areas where it was used to control rodent populations. As Dr. Harrison documented his findings, he became aware of an oppressive atmosphere within the Hartwell establishment. Meaningful glances were exchanged by the family members, their earlier warmth replaced by a cold watchfulness. Appearing in the doorway was Martha Hartwell, who had been preparing tea in the kitchen, with an expression that could only be described as predatory. With eyes that held knowledge far beyond her years, even young Rebecca, who had seemed so innocent, watched the proceedings. The basement preparation room, which Dr. Harrison insisted on examining more thoroughly, revealed additional disturbing details. Along one wall stood several large glass containers filled with various chemical solutions, some containing what appeared to be human organs preserved for unknown purposes. Claimed by Ezekiel when questioned about these specimens was that they were for educational purposes to better understand the diseases that claimed their clients' lives. But the organs appeared fresh, and some had been sectioned with a surgical precision that seemed unnecessary for simple preservation. Most unsettling of all was a leather-bound journal that Dr. Harrison noticed partially hidden beneath a stack of burial clothes. Before he could examine it more closely, his view was quickly blocked by Caleb Hartwell, who claimed it contained private family records. But in the brief glimpse Dr. Harrison caught, he saw what appeared to be detailed notes about various individuals in the community, including information about their health, their family situations, and their financial circumstances. In a difficult position, Dr. Harrison found himself as the examination concluded. His medical training told him that at least 3 of the recent deaths showed signs of foul play, but his evidence was circumstantial and the Hartwell family was respected throughout the community. Moreover, his accusations would be met with skepticism by local authorities who had known and trusted the Hartwells for over 2 decades, as he was an outsider conducting a routine inspection. That evening, as Dr. Harrison prepared his preliminary report at the Millbrook Inn, he was approached by several townspeople who had heard about his visit to the funeral parlor. A pattern that chilled him to the bone was revealed by their conversations. In hushed tones, they spoke of the unusual number of recent deaths, the way healthy individuals seemed to suddenly fall ill and die within days, and the almost eager way the Hartwell family responded to news of someone's declining health. From Sarah Peaton came one particularly disturbing account, whose elderly mother had died just 2 weeks earlier. Sarah confided that her mother had been in good health and spirits until regularly visited by Martha Hartwell, who brought homemade soup and offered comfort during a minor bout of joint pain. Within 3 days of these visits, the elderly woman had fallen violently ill and died before a doctor could be summoned. Immediately offered had been their services by the Hartwell family, waiving their usual fee out of apparent compassion. Not the first time questions had been raised about the Hartwell family's practices were Dr. Harrison's disturbing discoveries in Millbrook, though previous concerns had been dismissed or forgotten by a trusting community. A pattern of suspicious deaths began to emerge as he delved deeper into the family's history, a pattern that stretched back to their very arrival in Pennsylvania over 2 decades earlier. From Western Virginia in 1801 had come the Hartwells, claiming that Ezekiel had learned the funeral trade from an uncle in Richmond. Their property had been purchased from the estate of a recently deceased landowner, paid for with gold coins that seemed unusually abundant for a family claiming modest means. Showed by local records from that time was that their first winter in Millbrook had been marked by an outbreak of what was described as a wasting sickness that claimed 8 lives, all of whom were prepared for burial by the newly established Hartwell funeral parlor. Certain peculiarities surrounding deaths that occurred when the Hartwells were involved had been occasionally remarked upon by townspeople over the years. Families would later comment on how quickly their loved ones seemed to decline once the Hartwells began offering assistance, how eager the family was to handle all arrangements, and how they discouraged second medical opinions or delays in burial. But in a close-knit community where the Hartwells had proven themselves generous and caring, such observations were dismissed as the natural suspicions that sometimes accompany grief. Secrets that would have horrified the community had they been discovered were held in the basement of the Hartwell establishment. Maintained by the family behind a false wall that Dr. Harrison had not detected during his inspection was what could only be described as a laboratory of death. Lining the shelves were various poisons, surgical instruments far more sophisticated than any funeral preparation would require, and detailed anatomical drawings that suggested experiments going far beyond the simple care of the deceased. The complete version of the journal that Dr. Harrison had glimpsed was the most damning of all. This leather-bound tome contained meticulous records of every person who had died in their care along with detailed observations about the effectiveness of various methods and substances. A systematic approach to murder that had been refined through careful practice and observation was revealed by the entries, written in multiple hands over many years. Not just the methods of killing, but the careful selection of victims was documented in the journal. A sophisticated understanding of their community had been developed by the Hartwells, identifying individuals whose deaths would be mourned but not extensively investigated. Preferred targets were elderly people with few relatives, individuals with existing health problems, and those who had fallen on hard times. Their activities had also been spaced by the family, ensuring that no pattern would be obvious to casual observation. Described in clinical detail in one particularly chilling entry, written in Josiah's careful script, was the murder of Marcus Webb. Selected had been Webb because he was a widower with no close family and because his farm bordered the Hartwell property, making it convenient to dispose of evidence. Noted in the entry was that Webb had been lured to the funeral home under the pretense of discussing the purchase of a coffin for a recently deceased neighbor. Once there, He had been overpowered and subjected to what the journal euphemistically termed experimental procedures before being killed, and his body staged to suggest a heart attack. A complex mixture of financial gain, psychological satisfaction, and what could only be described as scientific curiosity about death and dying appeared to be the family's motivation. Their victims were regularly robbed of money and valuables, but this seemed secondary to their apparent fascination with the process of causing and observing death. Their experiments with different poisons, their observations of how various individuals reacted to fear and pain, and their attempts to perfect methods that would leave no obvious evidence of foul play were discussed in several journal entries. As perhaps the most cunning member of the family, Martha Hartwell emerged from the journal entries. Befriending isolated or vulnerable community members was her specialty, gradually gaining their trust before introducing poisons into food or drink she prepared for them. The perfect predator was made by her matronly appearance and reputation for kindness, able to approach potential victims without arousing suspicion. Gradually inducted into the family's activities as they matured had been the children. Despite her youth and innocent appearance, Rebecca had become skilled at identifying potential victims during social gatherings, reporting back to her family about individuals who seemed lonely, ill, or financially distressed. Expertise in the physical aspects of murder, learning to overpower victims and stage crime scenes to avoid detection, had been developed by both sons. Their integration into the community's social fabric was what made the Hartwell operation particularly sinister. They attended church services, participated in town meetings, and maintained friendships with many of the same people they were systematically murdering. A level of psychological compartmentalization that suggested either inherent psychopathy or a gradual descent into madness that had consumed the entire family was required by this dual existence. An escalation in their activities had been marked by the autumn of 1823, driven by both opportunity and growing confidence. The previous winter had been harsh, leaving many families in financial distress and vulnerable to the Hartwells' offers of assistance. At the same time, the family's success in avoiding detection had made them increasingly bold, leading to the accelerated timeline that had finally attracted Dr. Harrison's attention. A dilemma that would test both his professional integrity and personal courage was faced by Dr. Harrison. Clear evidence of foul play had been revealed by his medical examination. But accusing a respected family of systematic murder would be required of him to present his findings to local authorities, a charge that would seem incredible to a community that had trusted the Hartwells for over 2 decades. Moreover, Dr. Harrison was scheduled to continue his inspection tour to neighboring townships within days, and delaying his departure would require explanations he wasn't prepared to give. From an unexpected source came the solution. On his second evening in Millbrook, Dr. Harrison was approached by Thomas Creed, Martha Hartwell's elderly father, who requested a private medical consultation. The old man claimed to be suffering from severe stomach pains and asked Dr. Harrison to examine him away from the funeral home. They met in the stable behind the inn, where Creed's demeanor immediately transformed from that of a feeble patient to something far more calculating. "Doctor," Creed whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the street. "I know what you found during your examination today. The marks, the poison, the wounds that don't match the claimed causes of death. You're right to be suspicious, but you don't understand the full scope of what's happening in that house." A picture of evil that exceeded even the physician's growing suspicions was painted by what Thomas Creed revealed to Dr. Harrison over the next hour. Explained by Creed was that he had been gradually poisoned by his own family over the past several months, experiencing the same symptoms that had preceded the deaths of several recent victims. His advanced age and declining health had made him an ideal test subject for the family's experiments, but his survival instinct and knowledge of their methods had allowed him to identify and counteract their attempts on his life. According to Creed, the family's activities had begun as simple grave robbing. Shortly after their arrival in Millbrook, discovered by Ezekiel had been that freshly buried bodies could be exhumed and stripped of valuable jewelry, gold teeth, and burial clothes that could be resold in distant communities. Something far more sinister had this initial criminal activity gradually evolved into as the family realized that they could increase their profits by creating their own supply of bodies. The death of a gravely ill man they were attempting to rob had been accidentally caused by the family, which was the turning point in 1807. Rather than face exposure, They had covered up the crime and discovered that their victim's death was readily accepted by the community as a natural progression of his illness. Increasingly bold experiments in murder had been led to by this success, with each family member developing specialized skills and roles in their expanding operation. Revealed by Creed was that the basement laboratory contained detailed records of over 40 murders committed over the past 16 years, with victims carefully selected from throughout the region to avoid detection. A network of contacts in neighboring towns who would alert them to potential targets, isolated individuals, travelers, or anyone whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated had been developed by the family. His intimate knowledge of the family's methods and his ability to provide specific details about recent victims that Dr. Harrison had examined was what made Creed's testimony particularly credible. He described exactly how Eleanora Fairchild had been strangled, how Marcus Webb had been tortured before his death, and how Mary Patterson had been gradually poisoned over several weeks while Martha pretended to nurse her through a fictional illness. Also revealed by the old man was the existence of a mass grave hidden in the woods behind the Hartwell property, where the family disposed of victims whose bodies couldn't be passed off as natural deaths. The remains of at least a dozen individuals were contained in this burial site, including several travelers who had stopped at the funeral home seeking directions or shelter and had never been seen again. Both personal and practical was Creed's motivation for betraying his family. He had grown increasingly horrified by their activities, but more importantly, he had realized that his own death was imminent. The family had grown tired of supporting him, and recent conversations had made it clear that his usefulness as a test subject was nearing its end. His only hope for survival was to expose their crimes and seek protection from authorities. A plan that would allow Dr. Harrison to gather irrefutable evidence while protecting both of them from immediate retaliation was proposed by the old man. The key to the basement laboratory would be provided to the physician by Creed, allowing him to examine the hidden records and evidence during the family's absence at Sunday church services. This would give Dr. Harrison the documentation he needed to convince authorities, while Creed would use the same opportunity to escape to a distant relative's home in Philadelphia. With the implications of Creed's revelations, Dr. Harrison spent the remainder of the night wrestling. The scope of the crimes was staggering, involving dozens of murders committed over nearly 2 decades by a family that had been trusted and respected by their entire community. Sufficient to secure convictions would likely be the evidence Creed promised, but it would also destroy the faith and security of hundreds of innocent people who had believed themselves safe in their small town. The realization that Dr. Harrison himself was now in danger was more troubling. His examination of the bodies had clearly aroused the family's suspicions, and his continued presence in Millbrook represented a threat to their operation. Warned by Creed was that the family had killed to protect their secrets before, and they would not hesitate to do so again if they felt cornered. Precise timing and considerable courage were required by the plan they devised. Dr. Harrison would need to gain access to the basement laboratory, document the evidence he found there, and escape Millbrook before the family realized what had occurred. Meanwhile, Creed would disappear during the same time period, making it appear that he had simply wandered off in his senile confusion, a disappearance that would be tragic, but not immediately suspicious. Grey and cold dawned Sunday morning, with a November chill that seemed to penetrate the very bones of Millbrook's residents as they prepared for weekly worship services. A sleepless night had been spent by Dr. Harrison at the inn, alternately reviewing his medical notes and questioning the sanity of the plan he had agreed to undertake. The weight of potential evidence hidden in the Hartwell basement pressed on his mind like a physical burden, made heavier by the knowledge that his own life now hung in the balance. Detailed instructions for accessing the basement laboratory during the family's absence at church had been provided to him by Thomas Creed. As prominent members of the Methodist congregation, the Hartwells never missed Sunday services and typically remained for social activities that extended well into the afternoon. This would provide Dr. Harrison with approximately 3 hours to locate and document the evidence Creed had described. Small and ornate was the key Creed had given him, designed to open a hidden compartment behind the basement stone wall. According to the old man, this compartment contained not only the complete murder journal but also preserved specimens, poison supplies, and detailed anatomical drawings that would provide irrefutable proof of the family's crimes. More importantly, It contained a detailed map showing the location of the hidden burial ground where dozens of victims had been disposed of over the years. As the church bells began to ring across Millbrook, Dr. Harrison positioned himself in the woods behind the Hartwell property, watching the family emerge from their home dressed in their Sunday finest. A black suit that gave him a dignified ministerial appearance was worn by Ezekiel, while a dark blue dress with a white collar that emphasized her matronly respectability had been chosen by Martha. Flanking their parents were Josiah and Caleb, looking every inch the devoted sons, while Rebecca walked demurely beside her mother, her innocent appearance masking the calculating mind that Creed had described. How normal the family appeared as they walked toward the church was what Dr. Harrison found most disturbing. No trace of the evil that Creed had described was shown on their faces, no hint that they had murdered dozens of innocent people over the past 2 decades. Pleasantries were exchanged with neighbors along the way, smiles were given to children playing in yards, and they presented themselves as the very model of Christian virtue and family values. A full 30 minutes after the family's departure was waited by the physician before approaching the funeral home. Silent and imposing stood the building in the weak autumn sunlight, its stone walls holding secrets that would shock the entire community if they were revealed. Slightly trembled Dr. Harrison's hands as he used Thomas Creed's key to enter through the basement door, but his medical training had prepared him for confronting disturbing realities, and he forced himself to proceed methodically. Initially, the basement appeared exactly as it had during his official inspection: clean, organized, and professionally maintained. Spotless were the embalming tables, properly labeled and stored were the chemical solutions, and peacefully under white sheets lay the few bodies currently in their care. Only when Dr. Harrison began examining the walls more carefully did he locate the concealed entrance Creed had described. Behind a section of stone wall that appeared identical to the rest of the basement, the small key opened a hidden panel that revealed a chamber of horrors beyond his worst imaginings. Larger than the main basement was the secret room, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house and into the hillside beyond. Lining the walls were shelves containing hundreds of glass jars filled with preserved human organs, each carefully labeled with dates and what appeared to be experimental notations. A place of honor on a wooden lectern in the center of the room was occupied by the murder journal. Thick with years of entries written in multiple hands was the leather-bound volume, but with consistent attention to detail that spoke of scientific methodology applied to the act of murder. The technical aspects of what he was reading were understood by Dr. Harrison's medical training, but perhaps more horrifying than the murders themselves was the clinical precision with which the family had documented their crimes. A similar format was followed by each entry: identification of the victim, method of approach, technique employed for killing, observations about the victim's reactions, and notes for future reference. A progression from simple poisonings to increasingly sophisticated methods that suggested years of practice and refinement was revealed by the entries. Experiments with various surgical techniques apparently conducted on living victims to study their effects were shown by recent entries. That the family's activities extended far beyond Millbrook was what shocked Dr. Harrison most. Documented in the journal were murders in at least 6 different Pennsylvania townships, with victims selected during the family's travels to provide funeral services for distant clients. A system for identifying vulnerable individuals in each community had been developed by them, often returning months later to commit crimes in areas where they were less likely to be suspected. Even more disturbing than the journal entries were the anatomical drawings. Detailed illustrations showed the progression of various experimental procedures with careful notations about which techniques produced the most fear in victims and which methods were most effective for different types of people. That the family viewed their victims not as human beings but as subjects for scientific study was suggested by the drawings, approaching murder with the same methodical precision that legitimate researchers might apply to animal specimens. Voices outside the building became aware of by Dr. Harrison as he continued his examination of the hidden chamber. With growing alarm, he realized as he glanced at his pocket watch that he had been in the basement for over 2 hours, absorbed in documenting the evidence he had discovered. Louder grew the voices, and he recognized the distinctive cadence of Ezekiel Hartwell's speech as the family returned from church much earlier than expected. Panic seized Dr. Harrison as he realized his precarious situation. He was trapped in the secret chamber with damning evidence of the family's crimes, and they would certainly kill him if they discovered his presence. Closer to the building moved the voices, and he could hear footsteps on the wooden porch above his head. Directly into their path would take him his escape route through the basement door, but remaining hidden in the chamber would only delay his discovery until they came to check on their secrets. Just when we thought Dr. Harrison's investigation might expose the horrible truth about the Hartwell family, the situation takes a deadly turn. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this house of horrors. In his desperate search for an alternative escape route, Dr. Harrison noticed that the secret chamber extended further than he had initially realized. At the far end of the room, partially concealed behind stacks of glass specimen jars, was another door that appeared to lead deeper into the hillside. With the family's voices growing ever closer, he had no choice but to risk exploring this unknown passage, hoping it might lead to freedom rather than deeper into the nightmare he had uncovered. Through a hand-carved tunnel that extended deep into the hillside behind the Hartwell property led the narrow passage behind the specimen chamber Dr. Harrison. Rough stone were the walls, carved with simple tools, but showing evidence of years of gradual expansion. As he moved through the tunnel by the light of a candle he had found in the chamber, the physician began to understand the true scope of the Hartwell family's operation. Into a natural cave that had been converted into what could only be described as a charnel house opened the tunnel. Scattered throughout the cavern were human remains, some carefully arranged on stone shelves, others simply piled in corners where they had been hastily discarded. Overwhelming was the smell of death and decay. But Dr. Harrison's medical training allowed him to examine the scene with professional detachment, despite his horror. The full extent of the family's crimes was revealed by what he discovered in that underground cemetery. The remains of at least 40 individuals were present in various states of decay, representing decades of systematic murder. Evidence of the experimental procedures documented in the journal was shown by some of the bodies, while others appeared to have been killed quickly and efficiently. Scattered among the remains were personal effects, jewelry, clothing, coins, suggesting that robbery had indeed been a significant motivation for many of the murders. A section of the cave where recent victims had been displayed almost like trophies was the most disturbing of all. Recognized by Dr. Harrison were clothing and jewelry belonging to several individuals he had examined during his official inspection, confirming that the Hartwells had been systematically murdering their clients rather than simply preparing natural deaths for burial. That the family visited this underground chamber regularly, perhaps to relive their crimes or to continue their grotesque experiments, was suggested by the clinical arrangement of these bodies. As Dr. Harrison documented what he found in the cave, he heard voices echoing through the tunnel behind him. His absence from the inn had been discovered by the Hartwells, and they had apparently found evidence of his intrusion into their secret chamber. His name was called by multiple voices, but their tone was not one of concern. It was the patient, predatory sound of hunters pursuing cornered prey. Multiple exits were proved to have by the cave system, and Dr. Harrison managed to escape through a narrow opening that led to the wooded hillside above the Hartwell property. From this vantage point, he could see the family searching the area around their home, moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had conducted such searches before. That Dr. Harrison was not the first person to discover their secrets became clear, and the methodical way they combed the area suggested that previous investigators had not survived their discoveries. All his knowledge of wilderness survival and considerable luck were required by the physician's escape from Millbrook. He was forced to abandon his belongings at the inn and travel cross-country toward the nearest substantial town, avoiding roads where the Hartwells might pursue him. Enough documentation to convince authorities was contained in his medical bag, but he needed to reach civilized areas before the family could silence him permanently. What Dr. Harrison didn't know was that Thomas Creed had not escaped as planned. The old man had been discovered attempting to leave the house and had been confronted by his family about his betrayal. Everything about his arrangement with Dr. Harrison had been revealed by Creed under torture, including the physician's plans to document their crimes and expose them to authorities. This revelation had prompted the family to return early from church and begin their search for Dr. Harrison. More ominously, it had convinced them that their operation in Millbrook was no longer sustainable. Rather than simply eliminating Dr. Harrison and continuing their activities, they had decided to abandon their established base and relocate to a new community where they could start fresh. As carefully planned as their crimes had been was the Hartwells' departure from Millbrook. They claimed that Ezekiel had received an urgent message about a dying relative in Ohio, necessitating an immediate journey that might keep them away for several months. The funeral home would be temporarily closed, and they asked neighbors to keep watch over their property during their absence. To most of the community, this seemed like a reasonable family emergency that required their sympathy and support. What the townspeople didn't realize was that the Hartwells were methodically destroying evidence of their crimes before leaving. The secret chamber was emptied and sealed. Partially collapsed was the cave system to hide the remains it contained, and all documentary evidence of their activities was either destroyed or packed for transport to their new location. By the time Dr. Harrison reached authorities in Philadelphia 3 days later, the Hartwell family had vanished completely, leaving behind only an empty funeral home and a community that would never suspect the horrors that had been committed in their midst. With skepticism by Philadelphia authorities was met Dr. Harrison's account of what he had discovered, who found it difficult to believe that a respected family could have committed such extensive crimes without detection. Compelling was the physician's evidence, but much of it had been destroyed or hidden by the time investigators reached Millbrook. Insufficient to support the full scope of Dr. Harrison's accusations were the few remains they managed to recover from the partially collapsed cave system. The community's resistance to believing such terrible things about the Hartwell family hampered the investigation that followed. Character references for the Hartwells were provided by townspeople, insisting that they had been generous, caring neighbors who could never have committed the crimes Dr. Harrison described. Without the family present to question and with most physical evidence destroyed, authorities were forced to conclude that while suspicious circumstances existed, there was insufficient proof to warrant a massive manhunt. The wandering of a senile old man who had become confused and lost in the woods was the explanation given by the family for Thomas Creed's disappearance. No trace of him was found by search parties, and his fate remained officially unknown, though Dr. Harrison had no doubt that Creed had paid the ultimate price for his attempt to expose his family's crimes. 4 years to come, the aftermath of Dr. Harrison's discoveries haunted both him and the community of Millbrook. Detailed reports were submitted by the physician to state authorities, but without the Hartwell family present to question and with most physical evidence destroyed, the case was eventually classified as inconclusive and filed away in the growing bureaucracy of the Pennsylvania state government. In what he had witnessed, Dr. Harrison never stopped believing, and he spent considerable personal resources attempting to track down the Hartwell family. A pattern of similar disappearances and suspicious deaths in several Ohio communities during 1824 and 1825 was revealed by his investigations, but by the time he could alert authorities in those areas, the family had once again vanished. Over the following decade, Dr. Harrison documented similar patterns in Indiana, Illinois, and eventually the Missouri Territory, always arriving too late to prevent further murders or capture the perpetrators. With the possibility that they had been living alongside systematic murderers for over 2 decades were left to grapple the people of Millbrook. Some residents refused to believe Dr. Harrison's account, insisting that the Hartwells had been good neighbors who were being falsely accused. Others began to re-examine past deaths with new suspicion, wondering how many of their friends and relatives had actually been murdered rather than claimed by natural causes. For nearly 2 years stood empty the Hartwell funeral parlor building before being purchased by a merchant from Philadelphia who converted it into a general store. Reluctant to enter the building were local residents, and it took years for the community to fully accept its new function. Permanently sealed was the basement, and no one showed any interest in exploring the cave system that Dr. Harrison had described. Perhaps most tragically, the character of Millbrook was fundamentally changed by the fear and suspicion created by the Hartwell affair. Replaced by weariness and doubt was the trust and openness that had defined the community for generations. With suspicion began viewing each other neighbors. Rather than acceptance, a source of fear became death. And permanently fractured was the simple faith that had bound the community together. His work as a traveling physician was continued by Dr. Harrison, but he was forever changed by what he had witnessed in Millbrook. An almost obsessive attention to detail during his inspections was developed by him, examining every death with the thoroughness of a criminal investigator rather than a routine health official. as eccentric, even paranoid, began to view him his colleagues. But Dr. Harrison knew that evil could hide behind the most respectable facades. In 1847, nearly 24 years after his experience in Millbrook, a letter was received by Dr. Harrison that would vindicate his long-held beliefs and provide a final chilling chapter to the Hartwell story. From a sheriff in Oregon Territory came the letter, where westward expansion had carried thousands of settlers seeking new opportunities in the far reaches of the American frontier. According to the sheriff's account, a family named Caldwell had operated a funeral parlor in a small Oregon settlement for 3 years before being exposed in circumstances remarkably similar to what Dr. Harrison had discovered in Pennsylvania. The sheriff had read Dr. Harrison's old reports in federal files and recognized the identical patterns of suspicious deaths, systematic poisoning, and hidden burial sites. When authorities had finally raided the Caldwell establishment, they found evidence of at least 30 murders committed over their 3 years in Oregon. More significantly, they discovered documentation proving that the Caldwells were actually the Hartwell family, who had been moving westward across America for over 2 decades, establishing new identities and continuing their murderous practices in each new community. Alive had been captured the family, and during their interrogation, they confessed to crimes spanning nearly 30 years and covering 8 different states. Exceeding 120 individuals was their total victim count, making them among the most prolific serial killers in American history. Ezekiel Hartwell, now calling himself Ezekiel Caldwell, was 73 years old, but remained mentally sharp and showed no remorse for his crimes. Martha, Josiah, Caleb, and Rebecca had all continued their roles in the family operation, refining their techniques and expanding their methods with each relocation. The full scope of their crimes was revealed by the family's confessions and provided closure for dozens of unsolved disappearances across the frontier. In detail, they described how they had perfected their system of selecting victims, establishing credibility in new communities, and disposing of evidence. Most chillingly, they expressed pride in their accomplishments, viewing themselves as successful entrepreneurs who had simply chosen an unusual line of business. Executed by hanging in Salem, Oregon in December 1847 was Ezekiel Hartwell, followed by his wife Martha and son Josiah. Sentenced to life imprisonment was Caleb, where he died of pneumonia in 1852. Rebecca, who was still relatively young and claimed to have been coerced by her family, received a 20-year sentence but died in prison of unknown causes in 1851. Shock waves through communities across America where they had operated were sent by the revelation of the Hartwell family's true scope of crimes. Families who had trusted them with their most vulnerable moments realized they had been in the presence of calculating murderers. A cautionary tale about the dangers of placing blind trust in strangers, no matter how respectable they might appear, became the case. Now in his 70s, Dr. Harrison traveled to Oregon to witness Ezekiel Hartwell's execution and to finally confront the man who had haunted his thoughts for over 2 decades. Briefly spoke the 2 men before the execution, and surprise was expressed by Hartwell that Dr. Harrison had survived his discovery in Millbrook, claiming that several other investigators over the years had not been so fortunate. One last disturbing detail was revealed by Hartwell in their final conversation. Other individuals in their methods had been trained by the family, apprentices who had established their own operations in various parts of the expanding nation. He claimed that at least 3 other families were continuing similar practices, but he refused to provide any details that might help authorities locate them. The knowledge that the evil he had discovered in Millbrook was still spreading across America was ensured by this revelation for Dr. Harrison's remaining years. Never fully recovered from the revelation that their trusted neighbors had been systematic murderers did the Millbrook community. Gradually declined the town as families moved away, unable to bear the weight of their shared history. By 1860, Millbrook had been abandoned entirely, and the forest began to reclaim the buildings where so much horror had been hidden. Of the Hartwell family's crimes, few records remain today. Buried in government archives were the official reports. Forgotten were the newspaper accounts, and the communities they terrorized tried to erase all memory of their presence. But for those who study the darker chapters of American history, the Hartwell case serves as a reminder that evil can flourish anywhere, hidden behind masks of respectability and protected by the very trust and innocence it seeks to destroy. How serial killers could operate with impunity in an era before modern communication and law enforcement coordination is demonstrated by the story of the Hartwell funeral parlor. It shows how predators could exploit the natural human trust that bound communities together, using that very trust as a weapon against their victims. Most importantly, it reveals how ordinary people, doctors, neighbors, family members, sometimes held the power to expose great evils, but only if they were willing to look beyond appearances and act on their suspicions. Everything he had learned about the Hartwell case was documented by Dr. Harrison in his final years, hoping that his records might someday help other investigators recognize similar patterns of crime. He died in 1853, taking with him intimate knowledge of one of America's most horrifying family criminal enterprises. Among his papers were discovered his detailed notes, and they eventually found their way into federal archives where they remain today as testimony to crimes that shocked even the investigators who uncovered them. Beyond their immediate victims extends the legacy of the Hartwell family to encompass the fundamental changes they brought to every community they touched. The sense of security that had allowed small towns to function as extended families was destroyed by them, replacing trust with suspicion and innocence with weariness. In this way, far beyond the individuals they murdered extended their impact on American society, touching the very fabric of community life in the expanding nation. How easily evil can masquerade as respectability, and how the very institutions we trust for comfort during our darkest hours can sometimes harbor our worst nightmares is shown to us by this mystery. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Hartwell family's crimes? Or might there have been even darker secrets that died with them? Leave your comment below and let us know if you've heard similar stories from your own region's history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves dark mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and we'll continue exploring them together. See you in the next video.